In this video, I'm going to be going through the concept of the production possibilities frontier, or it's often called the production possibilities curve. The production possibilities frontier is a sort of technical application of the idea of opportunity cost, or trade-offs. So what we see in the production possibilities frontier is a graphical illustration of the possible combinations of total output that can be produced at any given point in time, whether by an individual, a firm, or a nation. The emphasis of the production possibilities frontier, or PPF, is on trade-offs in terms of production. This is really the first technical or first graph that we're going to see in any basic economics course. Now, to understand the production possibilities frontier, we're going to go into a very, very basic example just to make sure that we grasp the concept. Let's suppose that we have 3 hours to study, and a student is deciding whether or not they want to study economics or their biology class. Now again, the constraint here is on their time, that is 3 hours. So they have fixed resources in this case, and of course they want to use their resources very efficiently. So if we were to plot out in this table over here the different combinations that they could allocate their time, and then we can plot it over here on the production possibilities frontier. So the very first combination that we might go to is if we decide to study, say, 3 hours of economics, but that would leave 0 hours for biology. So on the horizontal axis, or the x-axis, we're going to go ahead and put a point here for 3 for econ, but on the y-axis, or the axis for biology, we're at 0. Okay, so we're at 3 and 0. 3 hours of econ and 0 hours of biology. To make it easier to follow, I'm going to switch colors. Another combination that we could do is we could decide to study 2 hours of economics and 1 hour of biology. So we're going to move from 3 to 2 on the economics axis and move up from 0 to 1 for biology. So we're now at 2 and 1. 2 hours of economics, 1 hour of biology. We might think of some other combinations. You could even go halves here. We could say, well, what if you just did half and half? We could spend 1.5 on economics and 1.5 on biology. So we could put a point here in the middle, say, okay, we're going to be spending half of our time on economics, it should have been a point, and half of our time on biology. Another combination that we might imagine would be to study only 1 hour of economics and 2 hours of biology. So here we're going to be at 1 for economics and 2 for biology. So 1 and 2. And the last combination that we might imagine would be, we'll go ahead and put this with green, is no economics and 3 hours of biology. This point here. So we're at 0 for economics and 3 for biology. So 0 and 3. So the production possibilities frontier would look something like this. So you could imagine many other combinations that are in between. Anything on this production possibilities frontier, that is, that's on this line, and we could break it down in terms of minutes, right? So maybe we could have 2 hours and 30 minutes of economics, and then maybe 30 minutes of biology. You could break it down to seconds if you wanted. For our purposes, we don't need to go that far. But the emphasis here is on how you can efficiently deploy your time. Now, we're not really production here. We're not producing anything here. So when we're looking at production possibilities, normally we're talking about producing something. In this case, we're not really producing. We're just studying. So you could think of it as time allocation frontier, but the concept still holds. So anything on this frontier would be considered efficient because it's on the curve. That means that you're fully deploying your time. Inefficient would be inside the curve. Let's say I decide I want to study right here, right? Well, that would be inefficient. Okay, I'll put an I there for inefficient. If I say, well, I'm going to study 1 hour bio and 1 hour of econ, well, I'm not fully deploying my resources. So we might think of this as being inefficient anywhere inside of the curve. Another thing that you might often see is something that's not possible, which let's say I say, well, I'm going to study 2 hours of economics and 2 hours of biology up here. Well, that's not possible, right? So anything that's outside the curve would not be possible. Something else to keep in mind here is to remember that you can only be at one point on the curve at a time. That is to say that these are data sets and these are decisions that you have to make. So for example, you can choose to be at half and half, studying half economics and half biology. You could choose to be here, but you can't be here and here at the same time. These are combinations that one must choose. Any point, any one of these combinations would be considered efficient, but you have to choose one. And people will often ask, well, what's more efficient, to study 3 hours of economics and no biology, or 3 hours of biology and no economics? Well, the answer is that they're both efficient, right? Now, one might ask questions about what you should be studying. That's sort of a different matter. But it is to say that in both cases, you're fully deploying your time in an efficient manner, meaning you're not wasting any of your resources. Another concept that we want to bring into the fold here is the idea of opportunity cost. Notice that when we went from 3 hours of economics to 2 hours of economics, and we gained 1 hour of biology, so we could just kind of maybe look at it right here, there was a loss of 1 econ, but we had a gain of 1 hour of biology, right? So the opportunity cost of gaining this 1 hour of biology was to lose 1 hour of economics. And that would be consistent no matter which way you went across it, right? So when we go from 3 to 1, or I'm sorry, from 3 to 2, we lose 1 hour of economics, but we gain the 1 hour of biology. So the opportunity cost of studying biology for 1 hour is 1 hour of economics that is not studied. So this is a basic way of reading the production possibilities frontier. Remember, inefficient is inside the curve, not possible is outside the curve. Anything along the production possibilities frontier is considered efficient. So now what I'd like to do is move to a slightly more technical production possibilities frontier, which is probably going to be more typical of what you're going to be seeing when you see production possibilities frontiers. Notice that in this case, we're looking at the production possibilities frontier for Caruso. Okay, now Caruso is the character that Robinson Crusoe that ended up stranded on an island, shipwrecked on an island, and let's just pretend that Caruso is on this island. He can produce two products, two goods, fish or coconuts, or more accurately, he's going to be catching fish and gathering coconuts. And he can catch up to 4 fish per day or gather up to 8 coconuts, or a combination of the two. So what we're going to do is we're going to plot this out, and we'll start off with the very first data set here that's given to us, and it says that the first combination is to collect 8 coconuts and 0 fish. So we have 8 and 0. The next combination, I'm going to keep changing the colors just to make that data set more clear. The next combination, we'll do in green, 6 coconuts and 1 fish. So 6 coconuts and 1 fish. The next combination, 4 coconuts and 2 fish. Our next combination, 2 coconuts and 3 fish. And the last combination, go with green again, is 0 coconuts and 4 fish. So our production possibilities frontier looks like this. That is, it's a straight line. Now you'll notice right away that the opportunity cost, or the ratio of trade-offs, is always going to be 2 to 1, meaning every time that you gain 1 fish, you're going to give up 2 coconuts, and every time that you want to gain a fish, you're going to have to give up, or I'm sorry, every time that you want to gain a coconut, you're going to have to give up what would actually be a half a fish. So with the trade-off of 2 to 1, we see that that's constant, meaning it's always the same. Every time that I want to gain a fish, I always have to give up 2 coconuts, right? So if I want to go, for example, from 1 fish to 2 fish, I'm going to be able to go from this point here, let's say 6 coconuts and 1 fish. I'm going to have to, on the horizontal axis, I'm going to decrease by 2 coconuts, but I'm going to increase by 1 fish, right? So we can see it both on the table. We're -2 here and +1 here. Now, suppose that you only wanted to gain 1 coconut, right? If we could go the other way, right? We could very easily look at this ratio and say, well, if I want to go from, say, 4 coconuts to 6 coconuts, then I'd have to give up 1 fish. But what if I wanted to go from 4 coconuts to 5 coconuts? Well, that's a little bit more difficult, because you'd go from 4 coconuts here to 5 here. What we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be moving to this point, which would be about a half a fish. Now, in real life, you may not be able to catch a half a fish, but at least as a matter of mathematics and ratios, that's what it would look like. So we see that this is a 2 to 1 ratio, meaning that it's constant at 2 to 1. And this is a good example of what we call constant opportunity cost, meaning that that ratio is always going to be the same, 2 to 1, or stated another way, 1/2 to 1. Now, in order to get the opportunity cost for both fish and for coconuts, it's simply a matter of division. Okay, so what we're going to do is take the maximum number, and of course you can do this with the maximum numbers when you have a constant opportunity cost that works the best. If you're not dealing with constant opportunity cost, it's a little bit different, but for our purposes, this is going to be good enough. The maximum number of coconuts that can be produced by Caruso is 8. Okay, so we're going to put that number here, because if we want to figure out what is the opportunity cost of every time he catches a fish, we're going to say, all right, well, how many coconuts could he produce? It's 8 coconuts. And what is the maximum number of fish that he could be producing? Well, it's 4. Okay, so we're going to put 4 in there. So 8 divided by 4 gives you, we could say 2 over 1, or stated another way, 2. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that every time that Caruso produces 1 fish, he has to give up 2 coconuts. So the opportunity cost of catching 1 fish is always going to be 2 coconuts. Now, when we're looking at the opportunity cost of the production of coconuts, we're going to basically use the opposite equation. It's simply a matter of division. What's the maximum number of fish that he could be producing? Well, that number is 4. What's the maximum number of coconuts that he could produce? Well, that number is 8. Okay, so 4 divided by 8 is going to be, well, we could do it a couple of different ways. We'll just say that it's 1 over 2 or 0.5. 0.5. So this is the number that we're looking for, 0.5. So what we see here is that each time that Caruso produces a coconut, he gives up 0.5 fish, or 1/2 of a fish. So this is the way that we calculate opportunity cost. Now, you can easily see it on your PPF or in the data table sometimes, but if you're trying to determine what the opportunity cost is, a lot of students will just say, well, it's 2 to 1 or something like that, or 1 to 2, and they don't really know what they're saying. So I think it's very important to write it out in exactly this way. Caruso gives up 2 coconuts every time that he produces a single fish. Caruso gives up 1/2 a fish every time that he produces a single coconut. And the beauty of this scenario of putting isolating Caruso onto an island is that what you're doing is you're stripping down all of the noise and complications of a complex economy. And we can very easily see that, Caruso could be producing at, maybe he would want to produce, let's say here, 1/2 and 1/2. Okay, he could produce there, and one might argue that he should produce there. Okay, and his production possibilities frontier might look like this. Maybe he wants to produce 1/2 and 1/2, but maybe not. Maybe he wants to produce more fish and less coconuts. Maybe he wants to produce more coconuts and less fish. But the key is that you have to understand that there's trade-offs. Now, once again, remember that anything inside the PPF means that he is producing inefficiently. He's not fully deploying his time and his resources. But anything outside the PPF is not possible at this point. Okay? Now, it may be possible in the future, but not at this particular moment. In this video segment, I'd like to explore the idea of economic growth and growing the production possibilities frontier through what we would basically call investment, or the investment in capital. So we're going back to our old friend Robinson Crusoe, who's stranded on the island producing coconuts and fish, and let's just say that every day he spends roughly 1/2 of his time producing coconuts or gathering coconuts, and roughly 1/2 of his time catching fish, and 1/2 and 1/2 would be two fish and 4 coconuts. So his current output might look something like this. However, Caruso decides he's just not satisfied with the production of 4 coconuts and 2 fish every day. So what he decides to do on every day he's producing these 4 coconuts and 2 fish. On day 2, he says, I'm not going to catch fish today. I'm not going to even collect coconuts today. I'm going to invest in what we call capital. Now, capital is basically a tool. It's a good that's used to produce another good. So we often refer to these as capital goods or physical capital. An example might include a machine, an assembly line is very complicated, a hammer, but all of these are forms of tools or capital. In this particular example, I want to use a very basic form of capital, and we're going to call this a net. And Caruso sits there and says, you know what, I'm going to put some sticks together and some vines together, and I'm going to invent this little primitive piece of capital that he's going to call a net. Now, there's other types of capital, like human capital, which might be a skill set, education, and other ways that you can make yourself become more productive simply by, becoming a better worker, by knowledge or know-how. But in this case, we're talking about physical capital, which is a tool. And let's just say that after he invests in this capital, he's now able to double his output of fish. So if he's not producing any fish, it's still going to be 0. But if he produces 25% of his time catching fish is going to be 2 instead of 1. 1/2 of his time catching fish is going to be 4 instead of 2. And 75% of his time catching fish is going to be 6 instead of 3. And all of his time catching fish is going to be 8 instead of 4. And so what we're going to see here is the growth of his production possibilities frontier. And so his maximum fish output is going to increase and grow because of his increased productivity in terms of the capital that he's invested in. Okay, so roughly speaking, it should have been right about here. So he can now produce, it's going to be a little bit off, but he can now produce on day 3, if he's still doing half and half, no longer is it 2, but it's 4 fish and 4 coconuts. Or I should say it the other way, 4 coconuts and 4 fish. So what he's done is he's grown his production possibilities frontier, not on the part of productivity of coconuts, but only on the productivity of fish. So although he did lose out on some production on day 2, he can ultimately make that back by increasing his production on day 3, 4, 5. But let's just suppose that Caruso is still not satisfied with his output in his production at 4 coconuts and 4 fish, producing half and half. So he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to, once again, on day 4, even though on day 3 he's getting more, but he's still not satisfied, he's going to invest in even more capital. This time, he's going to build capital that is specific to the collecting of coconuts. And this is going to be a ladder, right? Help him to climb the trees and gather the coconuts. And what this does is it allows him to increase his production of coconuts. Maybe it doesn't quite double his output. Maybe it increases it by, say, 50%. And these numbers are just made up, so, it's just for the sake of illustration or demonstration. Okay, so he's now able to produce, instead of 4 coconuts at half of his output, up to 6. And of course, it increases no matter what he's doing, no matter what percentage, if he's producing 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100% coconuts, it's going to increase whatever his output was by 50%. And so on day 5, well, we should look at this first. Let's see how it's going to grow his PPF. So let's just say that this is about 12, and it's going to push his PPF outward. Now, it's not going to do anything for the production of fish, but it will increase his production of coconuts. Okay, so now he may be producing right here. That's, again, that would still be half fish and half coconuts, and this would be his output. So on day 5, he's producing 6 coconuts and 4 fish. So 6 coconuts and 4 fish. So he's dramatically increased his output of fish and coconuts by investing in capital that's specific to the production of either fish or coconuts. So this is the basic way that you can grow an economy. Now, of course, in real life, it's much more complicated than that, but there's a beauty in looking at a very simple situation, such as, a man who's stranded on an island that develops this sort of primitive pieces of capital. And you can see, quite clearly that in the long run, if he keeps producing more and more, eventually he's going to have a whole extra pile of stuff that he didn't have before. But capital and investment require the postponing of current gratification, meaning that instead of producing goods to consume on day 2 and day 4, he invested in goods that helped him be more productive, right? Now, there's a million ways that we can do that. It could be going to college rather than, going on a vacation, or, buying a car that you might want to buy, or buying a piece of equipment or a lawnmower instead of buying say a snowmobile or a motorcycle. But it may be tempting to buy something that's more of a frivolous good, or something that's for fun or for pleasure and enjoyment, rather than doing the hard work and investing in something that's not necessarily very exciting and interesting, like a tractor or a college education. But the hope with these things, whether it's physical capital like a tool or a tractor or a net or a ladder, or it's human capital, intellectual, developing your intellect or your skill set, regardless of which one it is, both of them are going to help you become more productive in the future. So that, again, it requires you to make choices about the present and postpone gratification of what you can consume and produce in the moment so that you can produce more in the future. One way that we often illustrate the difference between two different economies, that one that may be producing more capital goods versus consumption goods, is to look at a PPF that looks something like this. Suppose that economy A is producing far more consumption goods. That would be things that you could consume. Maybe it's televisions, maybe it's maybe it's food and things like that, motorcycles, but things that are consumed rather than intended to produce, right? These are not tools, right? These are things that you might buy at the mall, frivolous goods to some extent. Not to say that they're bad, just to say that they're not investment goods. And this economy would produce less of these so-called capital goods or investment goods. And then economy B, that's producing more capital goods and less of the consumption goods. Okay, so what would happen if economy A was producing, let's say in year one, here on their PPF, right? Because notice that in the beginning, they can both produce the same combinations of capital goods versus consumption goods, but economy A is choosing to produce more consumption goods, and economy B is choosing to produce more capital goods than the other. So let's suppose that by year two, after this production has been taking place, during year two, economy A is going to grow because they have invested in some degree of capital goods. So what we might see is some degree of economic growth. And the economic growth might look something like this. That's good, right? So you're seeing growth, and that's good. But then if you compare economy A to economy B, because economy B was producing more capital goods, that is, more tools that are used in the production of goods and services, after a year of producing more capital goods, economy B can grow even further. And their production possibilities have actually increased beyond that of economy A, right? So kind of the lesson or the moral of the story here is that more capital or investment is going to equal more growth. Okay, more economic growth in the long run. Okay, whereas less economic growth is going to, less investment in capital is going to equal less economic growth. Real simple example, when I was in high school, I bought a commercial lawnmower. I was 16 years old. My dad helped me get a loan. I spent $6,000 on a commercial lawnmower. Now, at the time, most of my friends were buying things like motorcycles and crotch rockets and new cars and all kinds of gadgets like that. And that, certainly appealed to me. But by buying that lawnmower, it allowed me to become more productive, meaning I postponed gratification in the sense that I did not have a lot of fun things to, like, say, a crotch rocket or a nice new car. Instead, what I had was a lawnmower, and that lawnmower allowed me to work more efficiently and make more and more money, which allowed me later to buy more stuff than I otherwise would have been able to purchase. So the people who maybe instead of investing in, say, capital when they were 16, 17, and 18, which very few people are thinking about doing outside of intellectual capital or human capital through education. So by buying new cars, they didn't really have anything to show for it a couple years down the road. But because I bought a lawnmower, and that lawnmower allowed me to earn more and to become more productive, in the long run, I was able to, with the earnings from that piece of equipment, I was able to buy things like, say, a new car and all kinds of other things, because I ultimately grew that business over the course of, say, 10 years. So that would be a good illustration and example of economic growth. So again, more capital and more investment is going to ultimately equal more growth. And then in the future, you can choose to produce more capital goods and or more consumption goods. But the key is, the more capital you invest on the front end, the more stuff you're going to be able to consume later down the road. Now I'd like to take a slightly different look at how economies can grow by using the production possibilities frontier and the production of two different individuals to show what happens when individuals specialize, or it could be a nation or a firm, when they specialize, trade, and exploit what we would call their comparative advantage. Now, comparative advantage simply means to do something at a lower opportunity cost, meaning that you give up the least. So what I'd like to do is now consider a second person that shows up on the island. So we still have Caruso, and let's go back to our original example where he's producing either 4 fish or 8 coconuts, and we're just going to say, for the sake of this example, that Caruso, we'll use red for Caruso, he is producing 2 and 4, that is. So 4 coconuts and 2 fish. Okay, so that's his current production right now. And then another person shows up on the same island, and that's Friday. And Friday can produce up to 6 fish or up to 6 coconuts. But if he spends half of his time producing each, we'll use blue for Friday. If Friday spends half of his time producing fish and half of his time producing coconuts, he's going to produce 3 fish and 3 coconuts, so 3 and 3. So let's suppose now that Robinson, Caruso, and Friday want to exploit their comparative advantages and specialize in the thing that they are having the greatest comparative advantage in relative to the other, and see if they can grow their economy. So right now what we see, we'll start off here, is that Caruso is currently producing 4 coconuts and 2 fish. So 4, we'll use red. So 4 coconuts and 2 fish. Friday, I'm going to use blue for Friday, is currently producing 3 coconuts and 3 fish, making a total of 7 coconuts and 5 fish. Well, we got to do a little bit of math here to understand their comparative advantage. Now, there are some shortcuts here because technically the comparative advantage and absolute advantage are going to be the same in this case, but I want to go through the process of determining the comparative advantage so that you understand how to do it. So let's first look at Caruso. We've already done this before. So Caruso can produce a maximum of 8 coconuts and a maximum of 4 fish. So to get to figure out his opportunity cost of producing fish, we're going to see that he can produce 4 fish or 8 coconuts, and to determine the opportunity cost of fish, we're going to divide the number of coconuts by fish, which gives us 2 over 1, or, say it a slightly different way, 2. What does that mean? It means that Caruso gives up 2 coconuts per 1 fish. Let's also look at the opportunity cost of collecting coconuts. So for Caruso, he can collect up to 4 fish, same number, and up to 8 coconuts. If we divide the number of fish that he can produce by the number of coconuts that he can produce, we see it's 1 over 2, or 0.5, right? What does that mean? it means that every time that Caruso produces a coconut, he gives up 1/2 or 0.5 fish. Now let's look at Friday's comparative advantage. So in order to determine the opportunity cost, or I'm sorry, the comparative advantage for Friday, we have to first determine the opportunity cost. So these numbers are going to be very simple because the maximum number of fish and the maximum number of coconuts is going to be the same. So to determine the opportunity cost of fish, we're going to take the 6 coconuts and divide it by 6 fish, which is 1/1 or 1. So Friday is going to give up 1 coconut per fish. That's the opportunity cost of fish. So he's going to give up 1 coconut. When we look at the opportunity cost of producing coconuts, we're going to divide the number of fish by the number of coconuts. So again, 6/6 equals 1/1 or 1. What does that mean? It means that every time that Caruso, or Friday rather, produces a coconut, he gives up 1 fish. So we see that Friday has an opportunity cost, or a ratio, of 1:1, and Caruso has a 2:1. But again, I want to emphasize the importance of writing it out in this way. That way we're sure of what we're talking about. So let's determine who has the comparative advantage in producing which good. So let's start with the production of fish. Well, every time that Caruso produces a fish, he gives up how many coconuts? 2. Every time that Friday produces a fish, he gives up 1 coconut. So again, comparative advantage, what is it? Comparative advantage means relatively lower opportunity cost. Okay, so who has the relatively lower opportunity cost? Well, clearly it is Friday. Friday produces, he only gives up 1 coconut per fish, whereas Caruso is giving up 2 coconuts per fish. So it's Friday is going to have the comparative advantage in the production of fish. So we'll just write that this is his comparative advantage, or CA. We'll just do that for short, for Friday. Okay, so Friday's comparative advantage is in the production of fish. Okay. And for the production of coconuts, let's look at Caruso versus Friday. Well, every time that Caruso produces a coconut, he gives up 1/2 a fish. Where every time that Friday produces a coconut, he gives up a whole fish. So Caruso is giving up 1/2, while Friday is giving up a whole fish every time they produce a coconut. So clearly it is Friday, rather Caruso, has the comparative advantage in the production of coconuts, okay, because he's giving up less. So that what would follow is we would want, utilizing the theory of comparative advantage, we would want Caruso perhaps, and it depends on our goals exactly, to produce coconuts. So say 8 coconuts and 0 fish. And we would want Friday to produce what his comparative advantage is in, which is in the production of fish. So let's suppose that Friday is now producing 0 coconuts and 6 fish. So he's producing over here, where Caruso is now producing over here. Now let's bring that data down and look at what is happening after comparative advantage. So once before comparative advantage, we had a total output of 7 fish, or 7 coconuts and 5 fish. Well, looking at our data from above, we can see that Caruso is now producing 8 coconuts and 0 fish. So let's pull these numbers down. 8 coconuts 0 fish. And what is Friday producing? Friday is producing 0 coconuts, but 6 fish. 0 coconuts, 6 fish, making for a total of 8 coconuts and 6 fish. They've actually gained 1 additional coconut and 1 additional fish. Because with the production of coconuts and fish to the lowest cost producer, or the lowest opportunity cost producer, the end result is that they can actually produce more combined. Now, the final idea I'd like to go over is the idea of the combined production possibilities frontier. What we're doing here is treating Caruso and Friday, rather than treating them like 2 independent producers, we're going to combine them and act as if they're 1 unit or 1 firm or a single economic unit. So what we're doing here is we're looking at how many combined fish and coconuts could Caruso and Friday produce if they were producing together. Well, if Caruso and Friday only produced fish, the maximum number of fish that they could produce is 10. If Caruso and Friday only produced coconuts, the maximum that they could produce would be 8 plus 6, which is 14. Okay, so that's where these numbers come from. So we have a maximum of 10 fish and a maximum of 14 coconuts. Now remember that previously we had been producing here at 5 fish and 7 coconuts, right? That was our before trade and specialization output. 7 coconuts, 5 fish. So what we're going to look at now is how the economy is going to have a bowed out look, or the PPF is going to be bowed outward due to specialization. Okay, so rather than what we might have thought of before, and I'm not going to actually draw this, but imagine that this was a straight line constant opportunity cost PPF. You would expect the PPF to look like this straight line, just like the ones on the top look. However, it's not going to be a straight line. It's actually going to bow outward. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this in here, and then we'll talk about why it has that appearance. So when I say bow outward, what I mean is that it's got this kink in it, right? Because remember, after specialization, the maximum number of coconuts wasn't 7, but it was 8, right? So these numbers are corresponding to the new production output. So we could just call this after, and this is before. Okay, and the maximum number of fish, I shouldn't say the maximum number, but the number of fish that we are actually producing after specialization is 6. Okay, so we're producing here. We've actually grown outside our PPF. So our PPF is actually getting bigger to some extent. Well, why does it have this rather unusual shape? Why isn't it a straight line PPF as the other ones were with constant opportunity cost? Okay, well, this demonstrates the idea of what we call increasing opportunity cost. An increasing opportunity cost simply means as you produce more and more, you're going to have to give up more and more of the thing that you're giving up. Okay, so let's explain how this works. If we were producing 6 fish and 8 coconuts, we would have Friday producing all of the fish up to the 6th fish. And Caruso would be producing all of the coconuts up to the 8th coconut at an opportunity cost for each coconut of, we'll just write OP of 0.5. Okay, when I say 0.5, what I mean is 0.5 fish per coconut, right? Because you remember that from up here. Okay, so every time he produces a coconut, he's giving up a half of a fish. Friday, when he's producing fish, well, let's do coconuts first, and we'll come back to Friday. If we wanted to go beyond 8 coconuts, who would be the producer of the let's say the 9th coconut? Well, of course, it would have to be Friday, because Caruso is already maxed out. And so in order to produce any additional coconuts up to 14, it would have to be Friday producing them. And Friday can't produce at the opportunity cost of a half of a fish per coconut. He's going to be giving up fish at the rate of an opportunity cost, opportunity cost, not an OP, of 1 fish per coconut, right? So he's giving up a whole fish where Caruso is only giving up 5. This should have said opportunity cost, not opportunity P, whatever I was writing there, right? Okay, so as we increase in the production of coconuts, we are actually going to increase in the cost of each additional coconut, meaning we're giving up additional fish, more fish as we go into that 9th coconut. And you can actually see that as we're increasing in the fish, we start in a very dramatic way, moving steeper and steeper away from the number of fish, even as we're getting fewer and fewer coconuts. Okay, so let's also look at it on the other end. So when Friday is producing fish, he's producing them at an opportunity cost of 1 coconut per fish, okay, or 1 to 1. If we wanted to go to the 7th fish, that means that we're going to have Caruso producing the fish. So Caruso would have to stop producing coconuts, and then he would have to produce fish at an opportunity cost of 2 fish per coconut, right? So what's happening? The opportunity cost is getting higher as the production of fish goes higher. And what you start to see is as you increase in the fish production, right, once you hit this point, you start pulling Caruso away from the production of what he's good at, in this case it's coconuts, so that he can be relatively less productive in the production of fish. And the same would be true for Friday. As we move into the production of more and more coconuts, let's say into that 9th coconut, we're pulling Friday away from the thing that he's more productive in producing, which is fish, and we're moving him into relatively lower productivity in the area of coconuts. Thus, that's why the PPF has this bowed out look. It probably is worth noting here that our new production should have been noted at 8 and 6, because that's where it would have been. Okay, and this concludes this tutorial.